Hi, today we're going to take a deep dive into Locus Iste by Anton Bruckner. Alright, Locus Iste just means this place. The full translation is this place was made by God, and the text is from a Latin gradual used for the dedication of a new church, hence it going on to say it's a priceless sacrament beyond reproach. Bruckner wrote it to be sung at the dedication of this chapel right here, which is in a cathedral in his home city of Linz in Austria. So the motet is now commonly sung at the dedication of a new church, which obviously fits the words perfectly. But as a friend pointed out to me a few years ago, if you believe that God made everything, then it doesn't have to be sung in a church because, well, every place was made by God, so you can sing it anywhere you like and the words still apply. Anyway, this is Bruckner. He wrote about 40 motets, that is short sacred songs, of which Locus Iste is probably the most famous. It's also kind of remarkable because, well, look at this. C major, 4/4 time, allegro moderato, whatever that means, more of which later. First chord is just a nice open C major chord, and then we get some nice singable classic harmonies written in crotchets and minims that could have been written by Mozart or anyone really. That is to say, it's not actually musically remarkable or that adventurous, and although it does get a bit more interesting later with some vaguely chromatic stuff, it's totally singable and totally listenable to the modern ear. Why is this worth mentioning? Because it's really not true of Bruckner's instrumental music. His symphonies, for instance, were seen as really radical, full of complicated rhythms and counterpoint and chromatic harmony. None of that here, and really none of it, or hardly any, in any of his motets. Bruckner's vocal music is Bruckner being gentle and reverent and conservative, to be honest. Not too much to say about teaching this one. It's a short piece, only 2 pages in my edition. So if your singers are familiar with the idiom, you can probably get all the material covered in one rehearsal, even if this piece is new to them. There's nowhere especially obvious to start except the beginning, and if you do need to break it into chunks for a less experienced choir, I would probably still start with the first chunk, and then tackle the middle bit, which is trickier, and then the ending. Let me give one hint about rehearsal psychology though. If you expect many or most of your singers to already know this piece before you start, then that's great, but my advice is don't fall into the trap of letting them perform a full run through to you before you start working on it. The more they get to sing what they already know before you rehearse it, the more they'll settle into that comfortable, we already know what we're doing zone. And then it'll be really difficult to change anything much. To avoid this, I recommend jolting them out of their comfort zones as early as you practically can, ideally in the first few bars, to signal that you want to think about the piece afresh and they need to keep their brains engaged rather than just going onto autopilot. 2 good candidates for that kind of jolt in this piece are to discuss the opening consonant and to ask for a smooth 4-bar phrase rather than a 2-bar phrase. I'll talk more about both of those in a few minutes, but I just wanted to mention the general principle of how to approach rehearsals here. Alright, let's talk notes. There are some notes that are hard to pitch, the most infamous being this horribly exposed pianissimo C in the tenor part, immediately after 2 beats of terrifying silence, in fact, but with a B major chord still ringing in the singer's ears or even in the air around them, which makes the C into one of the most alien-sounding middle Cs you'll ever sing. Now, of course, singers can pitch it either by interval, D sharp to C is basically a minor third, or at least you can tell them it is, or they can do it by auditory memory. Once the tenors have heard and sung it enough times, it just pops into their brains at the appropriate moment. But actually, I think on the night, if you have a less than confident tenor section, then the main enemy of accurate pitching here is going to be fear, just because it's so scarily exposed, and on a page turn no less. What I like to do actually, if tenors are struggling a bit in rehearsal, is to talk about key centers. Because immediately before the scary note, the tonality is B major. And immediately after the scary note, the tonality is B major again. Well, I mean, near enough. So I point this out. From the piano, I let them hear the harmonies in bar 22, the bar after the scary note. and then I sing the B in that bar a few times, and then I get them to practice starting a semitone higher on the C. In other words, they don't ever need to think about the D sharp to C natural interval. They just learn how to approach bar 22, which greatly reduces the chance of pitching panic and paralysis on the day. Incidentally, I've not quite finished on this bar yet because there is another danger, namely of the pitch wobbling. This can happen because it's exposed and uncertain, or because tenors spent the two previous beats panicking rather than preparing their breath properly. The best antidote to tuning slipping here is not to pester them about tuning, which is counterproductive at the best of times, but to draw attention to the fact that the phrase needs to flow through to the first beat of the next bar. It is not ire, pre, and si, but ire, pre, and si. And if they think of it as one smooth phrase, almost one note without changing syllables rather than four scary crotchets, their tuning will become more consistent without anyone having to ever talk about it. Now, believe it or not, there are other notes in this piece. The whole chromatic section might be worth note bashing part by part, to be honest, and then assembling carefully to make sure all the semitones are the right distance. Why is this so tricky? Because the key center is pretty ambiguous, and when you don't have a clear idea of your key center, your brain doesn't know which semitones should be bright and which should be dark. It just needs carefully walking through, I think. It's only a short passage, and the feeling of relief when we get back to C major again is palpable. Other notes where tuning is important. The B naturals in the bass in bars 7, 9 and 10, which are easy enough to locate but tricky to keep banging tune. They all need to be bright, extremely close to the C. This leap down for sopranos looks awkward until you realise not to think of it as a drop of a seventh and just as the same phrase repeated an octave below. These arpeggios for sopranos aren't hard, but it's worth pointing out the E natural and F sharp respectively because they don't quite belong to the key. And then this lovely dark and swirling 3-bar quagmire at the end. Alto and especially bass needs some attention. Do not let the basses stick out of the texture with their octave leap, which is especially tempting for them, or to sound too independent with the chromatic C sharp to D movement. That C sharp needs to be imagined as careful, parallel movement with soprano E to F and not some kind of standalone jazz note. Now, real talk. Shall we discuss the first letter? There are some consonants which you can't sing a note on because they're unvoiced, and there are some which you can sing a note on because they're voiced. L is a liquid, meaning it's voiced, and therefore it has a note. And that note can be in tune, i.e. in this case it can be a C, la. Or if the singer's not paying attention, it can be hilariously out of tune, often a completely random note, la. Now, I wasn't being snarky when I said the singer may not be paying attention. If your singers have never thought about this, you will certainly need to draw their attention to it. The second time it comes, bar 5, it's even more important because now it's marked mezzo forte, and a stray pitch here, la, can be very disruptive to the flow. Speaking of flow, I try to make all these phrases very legato with long, smooth vowels. And that's true throughout, but it's particularly important in two places. Firstly, in the middle section, where the long strings of crotchets, quarter notes, can sound unpleasant if they're not smooth enough. And secondly, in the opening, where there needs to be a smooth handover of the phrase from the full choir to the basses. Encourage the sopranos, altos and tenors to give their crotchet on iste its full duration and then mentally pass the baton to the basses, who continue smoothly without a break. Again, it's even more important the second time this comes, with the basses needing to do a very sensitive octave leap rather than a spiky one. Thinking about things this way also enables you to make a 4-bar phrase rather than 2 2-bar phrases, so you can head for the important word factus before the slight phrasing away at the end. And the good thing about doing a 4-bar phrase is that you have more span for the phrasing, meaning you don't feel tempted to ask for a more over-the-top crescendo on the very first note. Much better at this stage to let that first chord just float there. You can take a little break here at the comma after the second phrase, mostly because of the dynamic change. In fact, in a big acoustic, you'll need a break, or else this piano bass note will be eclipsed by the loud ringing of the previous chord. And just as the basses had to work not to make their octave leap up stick out earlier, so the sopranos, and to a lesser extent everyone, have to be careful to support the leap down here. And I mean physically support, being sure that the vowels and the volume match even as sopranos cross their break. Sopranos in particular need lots of breath support from the diaphragm and lots of attention for this whole passage, or there's a danger they get past the high notes and mentally relax and the lower notes just go horribly flat. The drama of the next few phrases is obvious, and they sing themselves once the notes are right. Not a lot to say here, more octaves for the basses, but these are the good kind where singers can afford to give them a bit of weight, which is what comes naturally to basses anyway. The last thing to say is that the aforementioned swirling bit towards the end is an exercise in vowel matching. It's low in the register for everyone, and that gives it a very mysterious, dark quality, which I personally love, but it does need a bit of attention to make sure that everyone's air vowel is the same and doesn't sneak towards an A. Intonation is also vital here, so encourage singers not to push too hard. It says forte, sure, but trying to force a big crescendo when they're already low down in the voice will send things a bit skew-if. The forte comes more from a warm and well-supported full tone and less from pushing in the throat. Listen. When it comes to performance, this is a piece where a nice generous acoustic can do a lot of the work for you, as is no doubt the case in this place. A bit of echo will smooth out those opening phrases nicely. It will add energy to the sudden dynamic changes from loud to quiet, and it will help the frequent octave leaps feel a bit less exposed. In other words, with a large acoustic, you can be a bit less exacting and enjoy the drama a bit more. Just be sure your consonants don't get distractingly spitty on sibilus est. Keep it gentle and perfunctory there. On the other hand, in a smaller or more immediate acoustic, you need to be a lot more precise and treat it more like an English motet than a continental one. Give your singers lots of help with your gestures, phrasing, breathing, and very precise note durations at ends of phrases. And don't be tempted to take it too slowly. In this setup, it's not a piece to wallow in, but one to deliver very accurately. Bruckner wrote Allegro moderato, which is not very helpful, to be honest. But anyway, let it move along at a steady pace. Besides, if you start too slow, you'll realise it when you get to inestimabile and the basses sound heavy and pedestrian on their low notes. In terms of conducting, I'd definitely beat this in 4, albeit a very smooth and legato 4 for most of it. One of the most helpful things you can do is to support the singer's breathing and vowel shapes with your own face, especially at exposed moments like the very beginning in that scary tenor entry. And finally, it's important to keep supporting the choir during the agonizingly long 5 beats of silence near the end. Maintain eye contact, keep beating, don't let their attention drop away, because it's really important that the energy doesn't suddenly collapse there. The piece is not over. But now this video is. I'm actually a bit surprised how much we found to say about this mostly uncomplicated motet, but it can be good sometimes to pay attention to fine details, especially with songs that are well known like this one, so that singers don't switch off and render a just good enough type performance. I hope you have fun with it.